So we need to talk about a new case which was recently granted Supreme Court review. This case attempts to build off of a prior 9-0 unanimous decision by the Supreme Court, which impacts our rights to prevent the unlawful search and seizure of firearms within a home without a warrant. So let's break down what is happening in this critical challenge. Now, real quick, if you're watching this channel, then obviously it's safe to say that you care about the Second Amendment and your rights. Now, here's the thing, even law-abiding gun owners are ending up in jail because they make a bunch of critical mistakes. And those are mistakes that you don't even realize that you're making or that you don't understand that they're illegal. So I put together a free resource called the Legal Survival Guide. It's aimed to help you guys avoid all of those traps that maybe you could fall in. It takes about 2 minutes to read. It's just a simple PDF, and it really could save you years behind bars. I made it to help you guys, again, completely free to download using the link down below. It's just something that I wanted to provide you guys for free so that you can have it in your phone or maybe print it out. And there's a little card also in there that you can put in your wallet to give you additional resources to help you in situations. Obviously, not meant to be legal advice. I'm not your attorney. This isn't an attorney-client relationship, but I wanted to provide you guys some free resources to prevent you falling in some bad situations. Again, if you're interested, click the links down below. It's completely free to do. All you have to do is enter your email to get that free PDF. Now, as I mentioned in the intro, in this video, we're going to be discussing a new Supreme Court case that was recently granted review by the Supreme Court, and it involves when police officers and law enforcement can enter someone's home without a warrant. This case tries to use a prior 9-0 unanimous decision issued by the Supreme Court, which involved the warrantless search and seizure of firearms within the home. This new challenge pending in front of the Supreme Court is called Case versus Montana. This new challenge is trying to use and expand upon a prior unanimous ruling in a case called Keniglia versus Strong. In Keniglia, the Supreme Court found that the community caretaking exception to the Fourth Amendment's warrant requirement does not extend to the home. Justice Thomas authored the unanimous opinion holding that police officer's seizure of Mr. Keniglia's guns from his home did in fact violate the Fourth Amendment and his right against warrantless searches and seizures. This challenge, Case versus Montana, attempts to use and expand upon that ruling. And the Supreme Court recently granted review to this issue, so they're going to hear arguments on this case and they're going to rule on it this next term. This lawsuit results out of Mr. Trevor Case and his ex-girlfriend who called police on him, saying that he had threatened to harm himself and that maybe he also had a gun. Police officers entered his home without a warrant nearly 40 minutes after actually arriving to the home, even though they suspect that Mr. Case was not trying to, harm anyone else, but maybe he wanted to have some sort of interaction with police officers. The officers ended up entering the home, and there was some debate about maybe one of the police officers saw a shadow, maybe that he had a firearm, and so Mr. Case was eventually shot during that interaction. They did later find a firearm, I believe, in a hamper, but as a result of this interaction, Mr. Case was charged and convicted of assaulting an officer. Mr. Case argued that the officer's warrantless entry into his home violated the Fourth Amendment, so the firearm and other evidence that was found at the crime scene should actually be suppressed. Now, those arguments were later rejected by the lower courts, but eventually his challenge made its way all the way up to the Montana Supreme Court. The Montana Supreme Court affirmed the denial of his motion to suppress that evidence, but it was kind of a split 4-3 decision. There, the Montana Supreme Court, the majority there found that there was an objectively reasonable belief that something was wrong and that they could enter the home without a warrant based on an emergency basis. In this challenge, Mr. Case argues that the reasonable belief standard improperly dilutes prior court decisions where the court held that police officers may enter a home without a warrant when they have an objectively reasonable basis for believing that an occupant is seriously injured or imminently threatened to, injure himself or someone else. Mr. Case argued that the police officers lacked exigent circumstances to enter the home and that there could not be some sort of community caretaking function or some sort of emergency basis to enter the home because they sat outside of his home for 40 minutes before they actually decided to enter. So there was not such an emergency, present because they sat outside of his home for a really long time. Mr. Case also argued that the search was not justified under the community caretaking doctrine, which was also struck down by the Supreme Court in Keniglia versus Strong. The state of Montana argues that the objectively reasonable basis test, which the Montana Supreme Court used and the lower courts used, amounts to a probable cause in practice, and that really there is just a split about some semantics about what language was used, but they claim that that amounts to actually probable cause. Now, one of the big things in this challenge is Mr. Case and his attorneys cite to the unanimous ruling in Keniglia of the Supreme Court as support for their position in this challenge. They state that this case gives the court the opportunity to clarify the contours of the exigent circumstances doctrine as applied to emergency aid situations, an issue that has consistently confused and divided the lower courts since Keniglia was decided. They go on to argue that this court should take this case to resolve the standard for warrantless home entries under the emergency aid exception. In Keniglia, the court made clear that while community caretaking concerns did not alone justify a warrantless entry into the home, police could take such action to render emergency assistance if exigent circumstances were present. But because the case provided no occasion to examine the contours of the emergency aid exception, courts remain divided and in need of guidance. However, they argue that the lower court here in the state of Montana's Supreme Court really struggled to apply this doctrine and really just relied on an exigent circumstances doctrine and situation instead of really trying to determine what are the contours of maybe something like the community caretaking exception. They argue that to clarify that framework and provide the guidance Keniglia invited, this court should grant certiorari. Mr. Case argues that after Keniglia, many lower courts have been confused how to apply this standard and instead just apply something like a de facto exigent circumstances analysis, which the state of Montana really did apply. Now, if you're not aware of what happened in the 9-0 Keniglia case, essentially one night during an argument with his wife, Mr. Keniglia, got kind of heated because they were in an argument. And he got a handgun out and he put it on the dining room table and made a statement about, why don't you just shoot me and get it over with? And essentially his wife then, was concerned about what was going on. So she left the home and stayed at a hotel over the night. And then essentially the next morning, she tried to call her husband. He didn't answer. So she was concerned about him based on the argument they had prior. She called the police officers. She called law enforcement, told them to meet her at the home. They arrived at the home, police and the wife, and they found Mr. Keniglia essentially on his front porch. Nothing was wrong, but police officers were still concerned about him, so they took him away. They were concerned about him. They did a health, psych evaluation on him. They put him on hold. But during this interaction with police officers before he was taken from the home, he did state to police officers that he did not want them to take his firearms, that he did not want them confiscated, and the police officers agreed with that. However, what ended up happening is after Mr. Keniglia was taken away from the home for a psych evaluation, police officers went to the wife and said, hey, your husband said that we can take some of the firearms. And the wife believed that, that's what her husband had said. That's what police officers were telling her. So they ended up actually confiscating those firearms. This case eventually made its way all the way to the Supreme Court back in 2021. And on review, the Supreme Court issued a rare 9-0 unanimous decision in favor of Mr. Keniglia. The majority opinion in this case was written by Justice Thomas, and he stated in the ruling that the Fourth Amendment protects the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures. The very core of this guarantee is the right of a man to retreat into his home and there be free from unreasonable governmental intrusions. Justice Thomas therefore found what is reasonable for vehicles is different from what is reasonable for homes. And based on that, the Supreme Court unanimously found that the warrantless entry and seizure of the firearms of Mr. Keniglia was in fact unconstitutional. The Supreme Court has not considered the circumstances when police may enter a home, without a warrant under this type of exception since 2021, since they issued Keniglia. And there's been a lot of confusion down below in lower courts, like here in the state of Montana, about how to apply that decision. And in this challenge, Mr. Case wants the Supreme Court to finally step in, expand upon that ruling, and issue more guidance. This is important because it impacts everyone's protection against these types of warrantless entries within the home and when do certain warrant exceptions actually apply. The parties will now submit additional briefs to the Supreme Court, and next term, the Supreme Court will now hear arguments in this case and rule on this issue. The Supreme Court now has an opportunity to clarify or expand upon the 9-0 unanimous Keniglia decision, which can have direct downstream implications on what protections we all have from police officers entering our homes without a warrant to search and seize firearms and when do certain exceptions actually apply. Currently, this case is set for briefing, a hearing, and a decision during the Supreme Court's next term. This case is set for briefing that is going to be submitted to the Supreme Court by Mr. Case first, and that's going to happen on July 30th. And then the state of Montana is set to respond to those arguments on September 3rd. That also means that the arguments in this case will likely also happen before the end of this year because briefing is going to happen really early. And then I suspect there's also going to be a lot of amicus briefs submitted to the Supreme Court, maybe by 2A organizations and other individuals. So this is a case that we're going to be watching closely to see how this develops and how the Supreme Court handles it because it impacts a lot of issues, your Fourth Amendment rights, but also implicates the Second Amendment and the confiscation of your firearms and when law enforcement can enter your home without a warrant and maybe engage in some sort of conduct like what happened in Mr. Keniglia. Keniglia's case, where maybe someone lies about, wanting to confiscate your firearms and gets access to your home and takes your firearms, and when do certain exceptions actually apply and when do they not? So that's what's currently going on in this critical warrantless search and seizure challenge, which is in front of the Supreme Court. As we get more information, I'll let you guys know. As always, if you want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply subscribe to the channel. Also, you can check out my website, armscholar.com, where we have the free legal guide that you can sign up for. We have channel merch where you can get shirts and all that. And also have daily deals where I curate some, products that, are, I think, of value and that you guys can save some money on. So if you're interested, check that out. But as always, thank you all for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And don't forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.